We have a great session lined up here on ensuring the right rights management with Kathleen Cameron of Google. If you're looking for how DAM and other digital interface systems work in concert with Hilton, head back to the Agenda tab and click track 1. Or for preserving the Philadelphia sound, forward-thinking engagement through DAM, and that's with the Philadelphia Orchestra and Teresa Regley, head back to track 2. But I think you know you picked the right track right here, track 3. Now, if there was ever a subject in DAM that doesn't get talked about enough, it's rights. Doesn't get talked about, that is, until something goes wrong. An asset gets used in the wrong place or in the wrong way. And thinking about rights as you build and evolve your DAM and helping your search and asset users make informed decisions by making rights information available to them in a digestible, I guess, non-legal way can be really powerful. So to tell us about how Google has approached this, we welcome Kathleen Cameron, DAM Program Lead for Marketing Operations at Google. As always, pop your questions in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. So Kathleen, over to you.
Kathleen, could you unmute yourself, please?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Over to you, Kathleen.
Excellent. Sorry about that. Thank you. As Graham mentioned, I'm the DAM program lead for Google Marketing Operations, and we have a digital asset management program like so many of you. And what we found were we have the same basic set of problems that so many of you are facing. We started DAM program because assets are not centralized. And we spend a lot of effort trying to find those assets, get those assets cataloged into a digital asset management tool so that we can manage them, share them, distribute them, all the wonderful things that DAM does. And then sometimes we quickly realize that rights are also not centralized and are disconnected from all that valuable data that we've spent adding to our assets within a DAM. Sort of the third problem we are facing is there's no data on reuse. We've got these assets in a DAM. We don't know how people are reusing our assets. And then we lose track not only of that valuable data, but also whether or not people are adhering to the rights, which they may or may not even know about. And I apologize, my computer has decided, of course, to be slow. So we took we know that we're scaling across the globe. So rights are going to vary by region and by country. And we saw this as an opportunity to talk to our stakeholders about the types of rights they're getting, about the types of reuse that they need from the assets that we have in our DAM, and how could we combine those efforts to inform our stakeholders to perhaps get broader rights so that assets are more easily shared, and also understand when specific rights, very narrow rights, are used, and how do we track that and assign those rights to the assets. So we took a user-focused approach. We know rights can be complex, and we don't expect marketers to read license agreements. In fact, we probably don't want them to read license agreements if they had access to them. We want to create a summary information so that they can gain a quick understanding of how an asset can get used that they discover in our digital asset management program. We know that we have rights data that we need to collect and associate with those assets, much like we have descriptive metadata that we're associating with those assets, and that those things need to connect in order for that information to be most helpful to the users of our digital asset management system. We also know that we want to track those usage and rights information very closely. We want to understand the types of licenses. We want to understand the types of reuse. That data can help then inform marketers and potentially impact marketing budgets. If we're able to allow marketers to reuse assets, that could save on additional photography or video production, for example. We stop recreating the wheel. Everything's in a central place, including the rights information. So we reached out to our users. We had lots of conversations. We understood their pain points before we moved forward. And so we generated this hypothesis. We understand that most people have a project, and a project could be a campaign, it could be a creative brief, it could be a scope of work with an agency partner, for example. We want to take what's already familiar with our stakeholders and leverage that as part of our change management process. We also know that projects are defined before creative assets are even built. So we wanted to build in that flexibility to allow that data to be started as it's getting created. So if I'm given a creative brief, I can add that information into the project while I have producers out on a photo shoot, for example, and they're negotiating with talent and photographers and whatnot, and then that information gets added. We know that, you know, as rights gets negotiated, we don't want to lose that information and people panic at the wrap of a project. So they can add that information as it comes in. We also know that sometimes rights are negotiated very late in the process, especially if you're doing video production. Maybe a music track is changed at the 11th hour. So we, again, we knew we had to do flexible structure when we built this model. And we know that we have rights that are going to be associated with lots of projects. So we couldn't make it super linear. Again, flexibility became sort of a key theme for us. So this is the framework we ended up building towards. We have the who, the what, and the where. And the who are the people that own the intellectual property. We call them grantors or entities, but really this becomes sort of a contact card, if you will. This is the person who is granting rights. And we keep that separate from the agreements because we know we might strike multiple agreements with a photographer, for example. And then the what are the license agreements. And in this case, we're just collecting summary information. We don't want to be records managers. We have, perhaps your organization does have a separate records management function, or legal is managing those, or perhaps your agency partners are managing those agreements. Again, we just wanted the summary information because we don't want people who are not familiar with reading legalese to have to read through a license agreement. And then the where, and the where is really those projects. Where are those agreements being used? How are those agreements being used? Those are the projects. So we can have many grantors to one agreement. We can have many agreements to one project, but we at least have one grantor per agreement. And that helps us keep track of all the moving pieces. And again, flexibility was critical to the success of this. So let's talk through projects. Again, I think of this as a job card. If you've been on the creative side of the business, you might remember we used to route print proofs with job cards and a job jacket. This is similar to that. What's that key information that ties all those assets together? We happen to call it a project. You might call it something else, but you can see we have some basic information, you know, a name, if it's related to a campaign or event, what's that called? We have a description. We want to track project year and quarter because that's valuable information for us to report out on once a project is finished. We have several ID fields. We have who is our internal point of contact, who's the agency if we're working with an agency, or if we're working with an internal creative team, what's the name of that team? We want to know who's responsible for this project and who are direct contributors to it. So we have this as the starting point for this rights management process that we've built. Next, we have agreements. And again, you can see this is very simplified information. This isn't the density of a license agreement. We need marketers to know, can they use an asset or not for their use? And if the use hasn't been negotiated, they need to quickly figure out, do they have budget to ask for an extension? And then we would engage them on that process as well. So we've simplified the information. This is what we deemed was the minimum amount of information one of our users would need to determine if they could reuse an asset or not. And then the rights holder. So the rights holder, again, is that contact card, the who, how do we get in touch with them? And then we attach that rights holder information to the agreement that then gets associated with the project. And this is how all that data starts to become related. So you can see that the entity or grantor gets connected to an agreement, agreements get connected to projects, and then projects get connected to assets. And we do this relationship when we upload assets. So as part of the ingest process, we're now asking people who are uploading into our DAM to select a project and associate it with their assets. They don't also have to then figure out the agreements and the entities, because that's happened in our rights management feature. And as I just said, all ties into that project. So we've simplified that process for our users, that they can just go in as they're uploading, select the project as they're adding their other metadata. And then the user, when they go into the system, sees an asset detail page, pretty standard for most DAMs. And at the bottom, we've added a tab for the rights details. So in this case, I've named myself as the photographer. I've put a start and end date. Somebody coming into the system could see that. If they want to use the asset beyond 2023, then they have to negotiate an extension. You can see media covered. I've also named the artist for this particular sculpture, but you can see that there isn't a start and end date because I didn't put those terms in, but I did name the artist. We could also name additional talent. That happens to be my child in the photo, but she's given me rights in perpetuity. So she's kind of covered under my license agreement. And so then the user can quickly identify, can they use the asset or not? So even though we're sharing this amount of data with the users, the other part of this process that we heard from our stakeholders was they want to know how people are using their assets. So again, think global, we have lots of marketing teams. Everyone is managing their content a little bit differently, and they all want some control over reuse. And so the way we determined to ensure that they had some control over how their assets were going to get reused is through what we're calling a gated download process. So in most digital asset management tools, you can upload assets and you can download assets, and through permissions, you can choose who can download or not download. We still have those options within our platform, but what we've done is we've introduced a download form. And for low risk assets, a user would select assets, they'd fill out this form, and those assets would auto download, for example. If they're higher risk assets, like a video asset that has a lot of rights associated with it, the user would fill out this form, and the form would go into an approval queue for somebody on that particular team who owns that content to approve or reject. And this is sort of a secondary form of insurance so that our stakeholders are not at risk for misusing. It minimizes our risk for getting cease and desist letters and minimizes our risk for getting those very painful, hey, you owe us money, you violated your agreement letters that we probably have all seen. And so that's the end of my presentation. If we have time, I can run you through what it looks like in real time so that you can see how it actually functions, because slides are nice, but let's actually take a quick look at the real thing. So we have permission users that have access to this rights management feature. If we go ahead and say, here are some project boards, I'm going to go ahead and click on my project, which I shared with you a minute ago.
Kathleen,
And we'll
could
see
you
if the
switch on your
bandwidth
camera?
is. Oh,
Thank you.
yeah. And you can still see the, yes, you can see the tool. Can you confirm?
We can see your screen. We're still not seeing you.
Okay. Do you need to see me? Let me turn my camera on in a minute. So this is what it looks like in real life. I can go ahead and manage this project. I can view assets associated with it from within the rights management feature. I can view the entities and the agreements all together. So if I click here, then I can see how many projects, how many agreements, and how many assets are associated with this photographer. I can do the same thing on agreements. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if it's, and then we can take some questions.
And actually, we do have quite a few questions already coming in from the room. Maybe first one, how do you go about sort of digesting the rights from license agreements down into these sort of more user-friendly formats? And like, is there a team that does that? Like, who and how do you tackle that?
That's an excellent question. So we are empowering the people that have negotiated the rights to add that information. So instead of passing it on and us being a bottleneck, we're encouraging either our agency partners or internal producers who are negotiating those rights to go ahead and add that information, because it's probably top of their mind, and then we don't have to have a long conversation of back and forth. It's much more expedient to have the people who have the rights in hand to actually enter that information.
How did you approach sort of coaching the legal teams through trusting that this information is going to be, used appropriately?
That's an excellent question. So we've spent a lot of time talking with our legal team and also our diversity team about what we can and cannot collect. So we've gone through a risk management assessment on what information we can collect. You'll notice that we're not collecting financial information. We don't collect any PII information really other than contact information. And so this is part of why we're not actually storing the agreements. We're taking that step back from being records managers of that information and only taking in that summary information. And that seemed to be acceptable for our legal team.
You mentioned that rights information is sort of associated at a project level. Do all assets within that project end up inheriting the same rights? Can you customize rights to the individual asset level? Yes, we can. Thank you for that. And I didn't demonstrate that. Yes, we can. So if we have a photo shoot, for example, and we upload those assets, we know that some of those agreements may or may not apply to different photos. So as the person uploading associates it with the project, they can then go in and say, this talent's not in this photo, or that talent's not in this other photo. So we do have the ability to go in and modify. Do these fields end up being mandatory? Required fields as you catalog assets? We have only a handful of required fields on the rights management side of things. We're trying to keep that as minimal as possible. And then on the descriptive metadata, we're about at 10 required fields. So of the required fields, that's the data we know we want to be able to report out on. So it's things like title, year, quarter, those sorts of things, basic information that anyone uploading the asset should know that information. That's fair. Interesting. Yeah, you don't want to make it too complicated. Well, that's actually one of your value propositions here is sort of decomplexifying, right? There's an interesting, I think, rather specific question has come in around, how you define regions. As I think as we work with different groups, even different industries, it's kind of interesting that there is no common standard for how regions are defined. How do you approach that? Because you kind of have to be industry agnostic in a way.
Yeah, it is a source of frustration for me as a librarian, and my taxonomy brain gets a little bit stressed. I'm sure most of you feel that same way, where there is no common standard to define regions. There are standards out there that aren't official per se, and so we work within some standards that we found in how we define our regions, and we've done it at a pretty high level. We've also chosen not to really focus on subregions or sub-subregions. So we've kept it as broad as possible and then gone from region straight to country. And then from country, we can also track languages in the descriptive metadata as well. But it is a little bit of a challenge. I've just gone through a whole taxonomy work group where we've been debating how we're going to define regions and subregions. So I appreciate that that's not easy. Really wish the Library of Congress would have tackled that one.
Or some standards body. Actually, just standards in general. How many helpful standards have you found? How many standards for, in the right space have you embraced?
Yeah, there don't seem to be as many standards in the rights space. So we've spent a lot of time internally on our team talking through how are we even going to define those rights categories? Because you saw we had region buckets, but we also have, what is the category of license agreement you got? Is it all media? Is it all media excluding broadcast? Or is it something very narrow? And again, because we have to think in global terms, this is a tool that spans across many, many countries. What are the most common terms we think are going to be familiar with marketers that will get them enough information to understand if their proposed usage is covered in an agreement? And so we've spent a lot of time on refining that list, making sure that the terms or the acronyms we've used will resonate with people across the globe.
Are there any standards that you would seek to influence? You mentioned region, are there any other standards that you would like the world to rally around for you?
I think in terms of, I think it's industry specific in terms of license types that you might have. So for marketing, there's probably a pretty common set of terms that are used. And we probably could help influence that list to a certain extent. It's going to be different for different industries. If you're in pharma, for example, you're going to have a different list of licensing terms than we're going to have in marketing. If you're in higher education, you're going to have a slightly different list of marketing terms. There probably are some common terms we could influence on sort of a master list that could be shared out. That's really interesting. We haven't thought about it. We've been so busy just trying to get this launched that perhaps we've been a little selfish, but we're happy to share what we've learned so far with anyone who's interested. So.
Well, I think you have an audience today that can help with that. Join forces, provide that influence. Actually, here's a great question that's coming from somebody in the audience about when rights change, when the rights on an asset change. How much, how far do you go in proactively communicating that change to those who have already accessed or downloaded the asset, or just in general, how do you handle the rights change on an existing asset?
So I think communications out to your stakeholders from within a DAM is a challenge for all of us. And that's sort of the next thing that we're hoping to tackle. So when an asset gets updated, how do you let your users know? When an asset is expiring, how do you let your users know? Can you set enough triggers off of existing metadata to then, influence emails that then go out to your core users? And that, I think, is something that we're going to be tackling very soon. In regards to if rights change, on an asset, it doesn't happen very often that rights would change after we've already negotiated them. Sometimes an extension is created and then the rights are adjusted, they're iterated on. It doesn't necessarily impact the initial agreement. It just impacts sort of the next round of usage. People can then reference that. What we find is that people who have initially downloaded for a use on the first agreement probably aren't going to be as impacted by an extension to that agreement. So we haven't thought through notification to them that they might be able to have additional use. We would hope they'd come back into the system to check. So it's a little manual at this point. It would be great to get that more automated.
How about communication of expiry? You know, that there's just an expiry of an asset. Is that something that people pay attention to when they download, or are you able to alert them when something's about to expire?
Well, I don't know about all of you, but I find people don't read. They're really busy just trying to get their stuff. And so this is why we've opted for simplified data. We have a trigger off of what we're calling a summary expiration date. So we know that sometimes an asset will have multiple agreements. We ask the uploader to take the nearest term expiration. So if something's expiring in 1 year on one agreement, but 5 years on another agreement, sometimes we get that with photography, for example. Photographer will give us 5 years, but the talent only gives us one. Then the summary expiration date becomes that 1 year expiration. Anyone who has downloaded the asset will get an email triggered by that summary expiration date, 90 days, 60 days, and 30 days prior to expiration to give them plenty of time to take action. Wow. Either they have to pull the asset down or they have to negotiate a rights extension.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Thank you, because I was feeling that pain early on in my tenure at Google. Like, people panic, they don't know when something's expiring, or they hope for the best, and it's you know, we'll deal with it later, right?
Or I imagine some folks in our audience might have stories around people just not paying attention to that notion of expiration at all, rights expiration at all.
Yeah, there's also a lot of ask for forgiveness.
Yes, well, yeah, cultural thing. Maybe we have time for one more question. What sorts of measurement are you able to do on sort of your success in connecting with people on a rights level, that, you know, their ability to interpret and make good, useful, informed decisions? And, you know, how much have you over time evolved the way you represent rights to, you know, deepen that connection with your users?
Well, let's talk about the evolution of rights. Initially, like probably so many people in the audience, I had just a couple of fields in my descriptive metadata to start to try to keep track of things. That didn't give us much flexibility. So then we see a lot of redundant entry, and with redundant entry becomes typing mistakes, right? And then you lose a lot of data, or you have to resolve that data in complex ways at the end. This is a new feature we're just launching now. So I can tell you what our goals are, because we don't have enough data yet to say what's been successful or not successful. What we're hoping is, especially on that reuse data, is to say we spent X on this particular project or campaign. Those assets got reused this amount of time. We've got rate card information to say, well, if it was reused here and they didn't have to create something new, we know that what the value of that would have been if they had to create from new, and then we're going to derive savings from that. Sorry, that was a very complex math problem. And so we're going to try to use that data to inform our marketers and our marketing budgets in a future state.